Have you ever wondered who the person sleeping next to you every night truly is? Are they your protector? Or are they digging a grave for your future? My name is Susanna, and my story began with a single whisper in the dark that shattered everything I believed in. Welcome to Queen's Revenge. This channel is a sanctuary for those who refuse to surrender to betrayal. If you believe that everyone deserves to fight for their dignity, I humbly invite you to join our community. Please hit the subscribe button. Your support gives us the strength to keep sharing stories of courage, justice, and the power of standing your ground. The silence of the house at 3 a.m. was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, like a damp wool blanket pressed against my face. I woke not with a start, but with a slow, creeping realization that the temperature in the bed had shifted. The warmth that usually radiated from the other side of the mattress was gone, replaced by the cool, crisp touch of high-thread count cotton. I reached out instinctively, my hand sweeping across the empty space where my husband should have been. The sheets were cold. He hadn't just gotten up to use the bathroom a moment ago. He had been gone for a while. I lay there for a moment, blinking against the darkness, waiting for the sound of flushing water or the padding of footsteps returning to the room. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the settling of the house's timber frame. A vague unease began to coil in my stomach, tight and cold. It was probably nothing. Insomnia, perhaps. A glass of water. But the silence felt wrong. It felt deliberate. Pushing back the duvet, I slid my feet onto the hardwood floor. The air was biting, sending a shiver up my spine that had little to do with the temperature. I moved like a ghost, stepping carefully to avoid the one floorboard near the door that always creaked. I didn't know why I was being so quiet. I had no reason to sneak around my own home, yet an instinct, primal and inexplicable, told me to make myself invisible. The hallway was pitch black, save for a thin, pale sliver of moonlight stretching from the window at the far end. It illuminated dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. As I crept closer to the top of the stairs, I heard it. A voice. It was low, hushed, a baritone rumble that I knew better than my own heartbeat. It was my husband. He wasn't in the kitchen. He was in the guest study. The door cracked open just an inch. I stopped breathing. My hand hovered over the banister, gripping the wood so hard my knuckles turned white. He wasn't talking to himself. The cadence was conversational, rhythmic, but dropped to a volume that was meant to be concealed. I strained my ears, leaning forward just enough to catch the words drifting through the crack in the door. Just a little longer. She doesn't suspect anything yet. The sentence hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. She doesn't suspect anything yet. The words hung in the darkness, suspended there like toxic smoke. My mind, usually so organized and rational, fractured.
Who was she? Was I she?
The context was undeniable, yet my brain refused to process it. It scrambled for alternative explanations, ridiculous excuses to shield me from the immediate horror. Maybe he was planning a surprise party. Maybe he was talking about a client at work, a legal strategy, a negotiation. My husband was a man of business, a man of deals. Surely, this was just business. But the tone, that was what shattered the illusions my mind tried to construct. His voice wasn't professional or detached. It was smooth, reassuring, intimate. It was the voice he used to use with me when we were dating, the voice that promised safety and complicity. He was comforting someone on the other end of the line. He was conspiring. I stood frozen in the hallway, a statue of dread. My heart hammered against my ribs, so violently, I was terrified he would hear it echoing through the house. I wanted to burst into the room, to scream, to tear the phone from his hand and demand the truth. I wanted to shatter the quiet, but I didn't. The instinct that had told me to be quiet earlier now screamed at me to run. If I confronted him now, with nothing but a half-heard sentence and a gut full of fear, he would spin it. He was a master of words, a weaver of narratives. He would look at me with those calm, steady eyes and tell me I was dreaming, that I was crazy, that I had misunderstood. And without proof, I would have to believe him. Or worse, I would pretend to believe him while the rot in our marriage continued to spread. I heard the creak of his leather chair shifting. He was getting up. Panic, sharp and electric, jolted me into motion. I turned and fled back to the bedroom, my bare feet silent against the wood. I dove into the bed, pulling the duvet up to my chin, squeezing my eyes shut. My body was trembling, a fine vibration that I couldn't control. I forced myself to regulate my breathing, counting the inhales and exhales. In, 2, 3. Out, 2, 3. A moment later, the bedroom door clicked open. I felt his presence in the room, a looming shadow. He paused at the foot of the bed. I could feel his gaze on me, weighing, assessing. Was he checking if I was asleep? Was he wondering if I had heard? The seconds stretched into hours. Finally, the mattress dipped as he climbed back in beside me. He didn't reach out to touch me. He didn't spoon his body against mine as he used to. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, stiff and separate. "Where were you?" I mumbled, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I made my voice sound thick with sleep, groggy and confused. It was the first lie of many I would tell in the coming weeks. "Bathroom," he replied instantly. The lie came out of him so easily, so smoothly. There was no hesitation, no stumble. Just a simple, clean fabrication. "Go back to sleep, Susanna." I turned away from him, facing the window, and stared into the darkness. A single tear tracked hot and slow down the bridge of my nose, dripping onto the pillow. Bathroom. He had looked me in the eye, or at least the back of my head, and erased reality. If he could lie about that, about something so small and immediate, what else was a lie? The last 10 years? The vows? The finances? She doesn't suspect anything yet. The sentence replayed in my head on an endless, agonizing loop. It was a countdown, yet implied a timeline. It implied an end game. Whatever he was doing, whatever he was planning, it wasn't finished. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was an obstacle. I was a target. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay rigid, listening to the rhythm of his breathing as it deepened into slumber. How could he sleep? How could he lie there beside the woman he was plotting against and drift off so peacefully? The man next to me was a stranger, wearing my husband's face. The realization was terrifying, but beneath the terror, something else began to harden. A cold, sharp resolve. He thought I was the unsuspecting victim. He thought I was asleep. He was wrong. When the sun finally broke through the curtains, bathing the room in a cruel, cheerful light, I waited until he was in the shower before I moved. The water running through the pipes was my signal. I grabbed my phone and slipped out of the room, my movements mechanical. I needed to know. I couldn't live in the ambiguity of the whisper. I needed concrete ground, even if that ground was jagged and painful. I sat at the kitchen island, the marble cold under my forearms. The house looked the same as it always did. The coffee maker was programmed to brew at 7 a.m. The morning light hit the succulent on the windowsill just so, but the atmosphere had curdled. I unlocked my phone and opened our banking app. My fingers hovered over the icon for a second, trembling slightly. I didn't handle the finances. It was an unspoken agreement, a division of labor that had seemed natural at the time. He was good with numbers, I was good with people. He handled the investments, I handled the home. Now, that division of labor looked less like a partnership and more like a strategy. I tapped the screen. Face ID let me in. The total balance on the main checking account flashed on the screen. It looked normal. I let out a breath. I didn't know I was holding. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe the late-night call was just a work crisis he didn't want to worry me with. But then I clicked on the transaction history. I scrolled past the grocery bills, the utility payments, the mortgage withdrawal. And then I stopped. 3 days ago, a withdrawal of $500.
Cash.
5 days ago, a transfer of $1,200 to an account labeled simply consulting. 2 weeks ago, another cash withdrawal. $750. A month ago, $2,000 transferred to Tech Holdings LLC. I kept scrolling, my heart rate picking up speed with every swipe of my thumb. The pattern was subtle, buried beneath the noise of our daily life, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. These weren't bills. These weren't dinners or gifts. These were leakages. A steady, rhythmic draining of our resources. It wasn't enough to trigger a fraud alert, but collectively, over the last 3 months, it amounted to nearly $15,000. $15,000 gone. Vanished into the ether of consulting and tech holdings and ATM withdrawals in parts of the city we never visited. I clicked on the details for Tech Holdings LLC. No address. No phone number. Just a routing number that led to an online-only bank. My stomach twisted. He was moving money. He was siphoning off our liquidity, bit by bit, hiding it in plain sight. Footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, confident steps. I quickly closed the app and tossed the phone onto the counter, face down. I stood up and walked to the coffee pot, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the glass carafe with both hands to keep it steady. I poured a mug, the dark liquid swirling like oil. Morning, babe. He walked into the kitchen, smelling of soap and expensive cologne. He looked fresh, rested, the picture of a successful, loving husband. He kissed me on the temple, his lips lingering for a second. My skin crawled. It took every ounce of my willpower not to recoil, not to scream at him to get away from me. Morning, I said. My voice sounded hollow to my own ears, but he didn't seem to notice. He was too busy pouring his own coffee, too busy checking his watch. Sleep okay? He asked, leaning against the counter, taking a sip. He looked at me over the rim of the mug, his eyes blue and clear. There was no guilt in them. That was the scariest part. There was absolutely no guilt. Fine, I lied. You? Like a baby, he said with a grin. Hey, I might be late tonight. Big case closing. Lots of paperwork. Paperwork, I echoed. Right. He set the mug down. Everything okay, Susanna? You seem distant. I looked at him. Really looked at him. I saw the faint lines around his eyes, the way his hair curled slightly at the collar, the man I had promised to spend my life with. And I saw the liar who whispered in the dark. I'm fine, I said, forcing a smile that felt like it was cracking my face. Just a headache. Maybe I'm coming down with something. Take it easy today then, he said, grabbing his briefcase. I'll call you later. He turned and walked out the door. The heavy oak door clicked shut, locking me in with the silence. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door. The whisper from last night roared in my ears. She doesn't suspect anything yet. He was wrong. I suspected everything. I walked back to the counter and picked up my phone. The fear that had paralyzed me in the hallway was gone, burned away by the cold, hard numbers on the screen. He was planning to leave me. He was planning to take everything. He thought he was playing a game of chess against a pawn, a piece that would sit quietly until he decided to knock it over. But he had made a mistake. He had woken me up. I opened a new browser tab and typed in the search bar, how to trace hidden assets in a divorce. The investigation had begun. The front door had barely clicked shut behind my husband before the air in the house seemed to shift from a suffocating pressure to a vacuum. I was alone, but the silence was no longer a sanctuary. It was a witness. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph of our smiling faces on vacation in Tuscany, every expensive rug we had picked out together now felt like a prop in a theater production that had been running for years without my knowledge. I stood in the center of the kitchen, my cold coffee forgotten on the marble counter, and felt the weight of the task ahead. If the whisper in the dark was the spark, the bank statements were the smoke. Now I had to find the fire. I moved toward the small room at the end of the hall that we called the library, though it served mostly as my husband's home office. It was a room of dark wood and leather, smelling of old books and the faint, sharp scent of his fountain pen ink. Usually, I respected this space as his sanctum. I was the one who curated the rest of the house, but this room was his. Today, that boundary felt like a fence built to keep me from the truth. I sat in his heavy leather chair, the springs creaking under my weight, and felt a wave of nausea. The chair still held the faint warmth of his body, a ghostly reminder of the man who had just kissed my temple and lied to my face. I began with the physical files. My husband was meticulous. He believed in the permanence of paper. I went through the filing cabinet, my fingers trembling as I flipped through folders labeled mortgage, insurance, taxes. On the surface, everything looked impeccable. The returns were filed, the premiums were paid. But then I found the folder tucked at the very back, wedged behind a stack of old appliance manuals. It wasn't labeled. Inside were credit card statements for an account I didn't recognize, a card from a bank we didn't use for our joint expenses. As I spread the statements out on the desk, the paper trail began to form a jagged, ugly map of a life I didn't recognize. The withdrawals I had seen on the app were just the tip of an iceberg. This private card was being used for things that made my blood run cold. There were charges for high-end boutiques where I never shopped, florist deliveries to addresses that weren't ours, and frequent stays at a boutique hotel downtown, the kind of place people went when they wanted to be seen, or perhaps when they wanted to disappear into a crowd. The name, Ilya Morrow, appeared again, not as a text message this time, but as a recipient of a wire transfer hidden in the fine print of a business account summary. It wasn't a large amount, $3,000, but the memo line was blank. It was a ghost transaction. I sat back, the blue light from my laptop screen reflecting in the window as the morning moved toward noon. My mind was a storm of calculations. I had spent a decade building this life with him. I had contributed my inheritance to our first home. I had worked double shifts in the early years to support us while he built his firm. We were supposed to be a fortress. Instead, I was realizing that while I had been busy reinforcing the walls, he had been digging a tunnel underneath them to carry the gold away. Every red flag I had ignored over the past year began to resurface, stinging like salt on an open wound. The late nights at the office, that were now clearly spent at that boutique hotel. The investor retreats, that matched the dates of the florist deliveries. The subtle gaslighting, the way he would tell me I was tired or overreacting whenever I questioned why he seemed so distracted. He hadn't been working on our future. He had been deconstructing it, brick by brick, and stashing the materials elsewhere. The afternoon bled into evening, and I heard the familiar rumble of his car in the driveway. My heart climbed into my throat. I had spent hours rehearsing a mask of my own. I had to be the Susanna he expected, the supportive, slightly tired, unsuspecting wife. I quickly gathered the papers, sliding them back into the unlabeled folder and hidden behind the manuals. I smoothed my hair, took a deep breath of the wood-scented air, and walked out to meet him.
Dinner was a masterclass in tension.
I had prepared a simple meal, but the food tasted like cardboard. Across from me, my husband sat in his usual chair, his tie loosened, regaling me with a story about a difficult deposition he'd handled that afternoon. He was charming. He was eloquent. He looked at me with a warmth that, only yesterday, I would have found comforting. Now, it felt like the heat of a predatory animal. I waited for a lull in the conversation, my fingers tight around the stem of my wine glass. I didn't want to show my hand entirely, but I needed to see him squirm. I needed to know if there was any shred of the man I loved left, or if he was entirely replaced by this architect of ruin. I was looking through the joint account today, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was a frantic drum. I noticed some withdrawals. A few $1,000s over the last few months. Some transfers to companies I didn't recognize, tech holdings, and something about consulting. The change in him was instantaneous, though a stranger wouldn't have seen it. It was in the way his fork stilled for a fraction of a second before continuing its path to his plate. It was in the slight tightening of the skin around his jaw. He didn't look up immediately. He took a slow, deliberate bite of his steak, chewed, and then swallowed before meeting my eyes. "Oh, those," he said, his voice casual, almost bored. "I told you, Susanna, I've been looking into some private equity business investments. Short-term opportunities. The market is volatile right now, and I'm trying to diversify our portfolio so we have a bigger cushion for the future." Investments, I repeated, the word feeling heavy and false. To tech holdings? I couldn't find a website for them. And the cash withdrawals? They seem frequent for business expenses. He let out a short, patronizing laugh, The kind of sound that was meant to make me feel small, as if I were a child asking about the complexities of quantum physics. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His palm was dry and warm. Babe, don't worry your head about the technical side of it. This is why I handle the finances. It's all very standard stuff. High risk, high reward. I'm doing this for us. Don't you trust me? The question was a trap. Don't you trust me? It was the ultimate weapon in his arsenal, the one he had used for years to bypass my intuition. If I said no, I was the villain, the suspicious wife destroying the harmony of the home. If I said yes, I was the fool giving him permission to continue the theft. Of course I trust you. I lied, the words burning my throat. I'd just like to be informed. It's a lot of money to move without a conversation. His expression hardened, just for a second. The mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of the cold, calculated man I had seen in the hallway at 3 a.m. It's my job to manage our wealth, Susanna. I've done a pretty good job so far, wouldn't you say? Look at this house. Look at the life we have. Just let me do what I do best. You focus on your work, and let me handle the heavy lifting. He withdrew his hand and went back to his meal, effectively ending the discussion. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully patted me on the head and sent me back to my simple life. But as I sat there, nodding and pretending to drink my wine, I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. The business investments were a lie. The cushion for the future was a lie. He wasn't building a cushion for us. He was building a life raft for himself, and he was planning to leave me to sink with the wreckage of our marriage. He didn't know that I had seen the boutique hotel charges. He didn't know that I knew about Ilya Morrow. He thought he was playing a game against an opponent who didn't even know the board existed. But the paper trail didn't lie, even when the man who created it did. As the evening wound down, and we retreated to our separate sides of the bed, the distance between us felt like a canyon. He fell asleep within minutes, his breathing deep and untroubled. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind working like a silent engine. I was no longer just a wife, and I was no longer just a victim of his greed. I was a researcher. I was a detective. And soon I would be his reckoning. The paper trail had given me the what. Now I needed to find the where he was hiding the rest of it, and where he planned to go when he finally walked out that door. I wouldn't confront him again. Not until I had every piece of evidence, every bank account number, and every name involved. He wanted a war of strategy?
Fine.
He had spent months planning my downfall. I would spend the next week ensuring his. The husband I knew was dead, replaced by a ghost who whispered in the dark. And I was done being afraid of ghosts. I was ready to become the storm. The evening air in our living room was thick with a manufactured normalcy that felt brittle enough to snap. My husband was sprawled on the sofa, scrolling through his phone with a casual, practiced ease that made my skin crawl. He laughed at a video, the sound echoing strangely in the high-ceilinged room, bouncing off the walls that I had painted and the art I had chosen. To an outsider, we were the picture of domestic tranquility, a successful couple winding down after a long week. But inside my chest, a war was raging. I sat in the armchair opposite him, a book open on my lap, though I hadn't read a single sentence in 20 minutes. My eyes were fixed on the top margin of the page, my peripheral vision locked onto him like a radar. He stood up, stretching his arms over his head, his shirt lifting slightly to reveal the skin of his stomach. It was a mundane, intimate gesture that suddenly felt alien. "I'm going to jump in the shower," he announced, tossing his phone onto the glass coffee table. The device landed with a heavy thud, face down. "Don't wait up if you're tired." "I'll be up in a bit," I replied, my voice steady, though my throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. He walked out of the room, whistling a tune I didn't recognize. I listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway, then the heavy tread on the stairs, and finally, the distant sound of the master bathroom door closing. The water pipes groaned as the shower turned on. I was alone with the phone. 4 days, that device had been an extension of his hand. He took it to the bathroom, to the garage, even to the dinner table. Leaving it here, unattended, was a lapse in judgment. Or perhaps it was arrogance. He was so convinced of his intellectual superiority, so sure that I was the oblivious, doting wife, that he felt safe leaving his weapon unguarded in his own castle. I stared at the black rectangle on the table. It sat there like a monolith, silent and imposing. I knew I couldn't unlock it. He had changed his passcode months ago, claiming security updates for his firm were required. But I didn't need to unlock it to feel the malevolence radiating from it. I debated reaching for it, but the fear of him walking back in froze me. What if he had forgotten a towel?
What if he was testing me?
Then the universe intervened. The phone vibrated against the glass, a harsh, buzzing insect sound that cut through the silence. The screen lit up. I didn't breathe. I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs, so hard I thought it might bruise the bone. The notification banner was bright against the dark background. Ilya Morrow, just make sure she stays in the dark. Almost there. The message stayed on the screen for 3 seconds that stretched into an eternity, before the screen went black again. I sat back, the air leaving my lungs in a ragged exhale. The name, Ilya Morrow. I had seen it on the bank transfer statement hidden in the filing cabinet, a ghost in the financial machine. Now here it was, speaking directly to him.
Speaking about me.
She. I was she. Stays in the dark. The phrase confirmed everything I had feared since the whisper in the hallway. This wasn't just a drifting apart. This wasn't a midlife crisis or a reckless affair. This was a conspiracy. Almost there implied a timeline, a finish line they were racing toward. They were coordinating. They were partners. A cold, clarifying rage washed over me, displacing the fear. Who was this woman? Was she a lover? A lawyer? A shark he had hired to tear me apart? The name sounded foreign, elegant, and dangerous. I needed to know who I was fighting. I couldn't fight a ghost. I grabbed my own phone from the cushion beside me, my fingers flying across the screen. I typed Ilya Morrow into the search bar, adding our city to the query. The results populated instantly. The first link was a LinkedIn profile. I clicked it, my hands trembling not from fear, but from adrenaline. A face stared back at me, a woman with sharp, intelligent features, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was beautiful in a cold, clinical way. Ilya Morrow, Senior Wealth Management Consultant and Asset Protection Specialist. The breath hitched in my throat. She wasn't just a random woman. She was a professional. Her bio boasted about strategic divestment, offshore structuring, and high net worth divorce protection. She wasn't just helping him hide an affair. She was the architect of my financial ruin. My husband had hired a mercenary to strip me bare before he even filed the papers. I scrolled deeper. There were articles she had written for niche financial journals with titles like The Art of the Preemptive Strike in Marital Dissolution and Shielding Assets, a guide for the modern entrepreneur. Reading the titles made me feel sick, physically ill. This woman made a living out of destroying people like me, spouses who trusted too much, who signed papers without reading the fine print, who believed that marriage was a partnership rather than a zero-sum game. My husband wasn't just leaving me. He was executing a raid. I went back to the search results. I found a connection between them on a social media platform, a tagged photo from a business leaders gala 6 months ago. In the background of a group shot, blurred but recognizable, were Ilya and my husband. They weren't touching, but they were standing close, their heads inclined toward each other in private conversation. He was holding a drink, she was holding court. That was 6 months ago. They had been planning this for half a year. While I was planning our summer vacation, while I was organizing his birthday dinner, while I was comforting him through stress at work, he was building a bomb with this woman. The shower upstairs turned off. Panic flared, hot and sudden. I quickly closed the tabs on my phone, clearing the history with shaking fingers. I threw my phone back onto the cushion and picked up my book, my heart rate spiking. I needed to look normal. I needed to be this she who was in the dark. Heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs. He descended, towel-drying his hair, wearing casual sweatpants and a t-shirt. He looked relaxed, scrubbed clean of the day's grime, but not of his sins. Water pressure is terrible tonight, he complained lightly, walking over to the coffee table. I watched him over the top of my book, forcing my eyes to remain soft, my expression neutral. "I'll call the plumber on Monday," I said. My voice sounded distant, detached, but he didn't seem to notice. He never noticed anymore. He picked up his phone. I held my breath. Had he seen the notification? Did he know I was in the room when it came through? He unlocked the screen, his thumb swiping quickly. A small, satisfied smile touched his lips, a microscopic twitch of the corner of his mouth. He typed a quick reply, his thumbs moving with practice speed, then slipped the phone into his pocket. "I'm going to head up to bed," he said, yawning theatrically. "You coming?"
In a minute, I said.
"I just want to finish this chapter." "Don't stay up too late. We have that brunch with the Millers tomorrow." "Right," I said. "The Millers." He leaned down and kissed the top of my head. The gesture, once affectionate, now felt like a brand. It was a kiss of Judas. He smelled of soap and betrayal. "Good night, Susanna." "Good night." I waited until he was gone, until the bedroom door clicked shut upstairs. Then I closed the book and set it down on the table right where his phone had been. The space felt charged, radioactive. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. A street lamp flickered 2 houses down, casting long, erratic shadows across the pavement. The world outside looked the same, but the world inside had irrevocably changed. I knew her name now. Ilya Morrow. The ghost had a face, a profession, and a digital footprint. She was the weapon he was using against me, but weapons could be turned. They thought they were almost there. They thought the finish line was in sight. They thought I was a foolish woman reading a novel while her life burned down around her. But they had made a critical error. They had underestimated the woman in the dark. I wasn't just going to stay in the dark. I was going to own it. I was going to use the shadows they had cast to hide my own movements. If Ilya Morrow was an expert in asset protection, then I would have to become an expert in asset retrieval. If my husband wanted a war of attrition, he was going to get one. I went to the kitchen and poured the rest of the wine down the sink. I needed a clear head. I went to the drawer where we kept the spare keys and the emergency cash. I took the spare key to his filing cabinet, the one he thought I didn't know about. Tonight, while he slept the sleep of the self-righteous, I wouldn't be crying. I wouldn't be panicking. I would be working. I had a name. I had a motive. And now I had a target. Ilya Morrow wanted to make sure I stayed in the dark?
Fine.
I would be the nightmare that waited for them there. I turned off the living room lights, plunging the house into blackness, and smiled for the first time in days. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just picked up the scent. The game had changed. It was no longer about saving my marriage. It was about survival. And I intended to survive with everything that was mine. The morning sun poured into the breakfast nook with a cruel, golden clarity that felt entirely at odds with the rot festering beneath the surface of my life. It was a Saturday, a day usually reserved for slow coffee, the rustle of the weekend newspaper, and quiet plans for the garden or a dinner with friends. But as I sat across from my husband, watching him methodically spread marmalade onto his toast, I felt like I was sitting across from a stranger wearing a very familiar mask. Every movement he made, the precise way he folded his napkin, the steady rhythm of his breathing, now felt like part of a choreographed performance. He was no longer just the man I had married. He was a tactical opponent, and today he was about to make his move. He didn't lead with the papers. He led with affection. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand, his thumb tracing a comforting circle on my skin. He spoke about our future, about optimizing our life so we could retire early, about protecting what we had built together. He was a master of the soft sell, using the language of intimacy to prepare the ground for the trap. I smiled back, a hollow, aching effort that made my jaw tight, and nodded at all the right intervals. I was playing my role, the she who stayed in the dark, even as my mind screamed with the knowledge of Ilya Morrow and the siphoned bank accounts. Then, with the casual air of someone remembering a minor errand, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. They were crisp white and smelled faintly of laser toner, the scent of bureaucracy, and in this case, a digital guillotine. He slid them across the table toward me, a high-end fountain pen following close behind, glinting like a needle in the sunlight. He framed it as a boring necessity, an update to our tax filings and a consolidation of assets for liability protection. He used words like efficiency, restructuring, and fiduciary responsibility, weaving a verbal web designed to make my eyes glaze over. He told me it was a standard procedure his firm was recommending for all partners, a way to ensure that if his business ever faced a lawsuit, our personal home and savings would be shielded. It sounded prudent. It sounded like something a protective husband would do. But I had spent the previous night in the dark, illuminated only by the glow of my laptop, learning the language of his betrayal. As I turned the first page, my eyes didn't skip over the legalese. They hunted for it. I bypassed the preamble about tax codes and focused on the definitions of transferor and transferee. The document was titled a property transfer agreement, but as I read, the true nature of the text emerged from the dense thicket of words. It wasn't about protection. It was about surrender. In the middle of page 4, buried in a subclause about unencumbered title, was the heart of the betrayal. If I signed this, I would be legally transferring my sole ownership of the condo, the property I had bought with my inheritance before we even met, into a new corporate entity controlled entirely by him. My personal savings account, the one I had maintained for a decade as my just-in-case fund, was slated for consolidation into an offshore vehicle where I would have no signatory power. He was asking me to hand him the keys to my independence and the deed to my security. He wanted me to sign away my past and my future while I was still wearing my pajamas and sipping my morning tea. I felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline pierce the numbness. I kept my head down, staring at the lines of text until they blurred into black streaks. I needed to control my reaction. If I showed my rage now, I would lose the only advantage I had left, the fact that he thought I was a fool. I counted to 10, feeling the pulse thrumming in my fingertips. I looked up at him, my expression one of mild, confused curiosity. I asked him why the condo was included, keeping my voice soft, almost hesitant. He didn't flinch. He leaned in, his voice taking on that persuasive, soothing quality he used when he was winning over a difficult client. He told me it was for my own good. He explained that by moving it into the holding company, we could avoid certain capital gains taxes later on. He made it sound like a gift he was giving me, a burden he was taking off my shoulders. He was so polished, so convincingly sincere, that for a split second, I wondered if I was the one who was wrong. But then I remembered the message on his phone. Just make sure she stays in the dark. The memory was like an anchor, grounding me in the truth. I looked at the signature line, a blank space waiting for me to sign away my life. Beside it, the fountain pen lay like a silver snake. I realized then that he wasn't just trying to divorce me. He was trying to erase me. He wanted to leave me with nothing, no home, no money, no dignity, while he walked away with Iliamaro and the spoils of our marriage. The power dynamic in a room is a subtle thing, usually felt rather than seen. For years, it had tilted toward him, fueled by his confidence and my trust. But in that moment, as I looked from the papers to his expectant face, I felt the scales tip. I realized that his entire plan depended on my compliance. He needed my signature to win. Without it, he was just a man with a briefcase and a series of lies. I slowly set the papers down on the table. I didn't push them back toward him, but I didn't sign them either. I folded my hands on top of them, feeling the texture of the paper beneath my palms. I told him, as calmly as if I were declining a second cup of coffee, that I wouldn't be signing them today. I said I wanted to have my own accountant look them over first, just for a second set of eyes. The silence that followed was heavy and sudden. The mask didn't slip entirely, but it cracked. I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, a telltale sign of his frustration. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating hardness that I had only ever seen directed at his professional rivals. He tried to laugh it off, a short, brittle sound that had no humor in it. He told me I was being unusually difficult and that there was a deadline for the tax filing. He pressured me, his voice dropping an octave, becoming more insistent, more dominant. He told me he didn't appreciate me questioning his professional judgment. But the more he pushed, the more certain I became. The desperation beneath his smooth exterior was palpable. He needed this done now because his timeline with Ilya was closing in. He was afraid. I stood up, taking the documents with me. I didn't ask for permission. I simply informed him that I would be taking them to my office to review them in detail. I watched as his face went pale, then flush with a suppressed anger. He started to say something, a threat disguised as a warning, but I didn't stay to hear it. I walked out of the kitchen with my head held high, the property transfer agreement clutched in my hand like a captured flag. As I climbed the stairs, I felt a strange sense of lightness. The she who stayed in the dark was gone. In her place was a woman who had seen the trap and stepped over it. I had denied him the one thing he needed to complete his theft, and in doing so, I had taken back the narrative of my own life. I went into my bedroom and locked the door. My hands were shaking now, the delayed reaction to the confrontation, but my mind was clear. I didn't need an accountant to tell me what those papers were. I already knew. They were a confession. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the stack of papers. This was the turning point. Up until this moment, I had been a victim of his deception, a silent observer of his betrayal. But by refusing to sign, I had declared war. He knew now that I wasn't as oblivious as he had hoped. He knew the hunt was on. I looked out the window at the quiet street, realizing that the life I had known was officially over. There would be no more slow Saturdays, no more shared dreams, no more illusions of safety. But as the fear began to recede, it was replaced by a cold, glittering resolve. He had tried to use the law to destroy me. Very well. I would use the law to bury him. He thought he was the architect of this ending, but he had forgotten one thing. I was the one who had built this home, and I was the one who knew where all the foundations were. He wanted my assets? He would have to fight for them. And as I tucked the documents into my own hidden safe, I knew that the game was far from over. In fact, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was the one who was almost there. The Monday morning air was sharp and unforgiving, matching the cold clarity that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. I waited until the sound of my husband's car had faded entirely from the driveway, his departure for the office marked by the usual confident roar of the engine. He had left with a lingering look of expectation, a silent pressure for me to reconsider the documents he had placed before me on Saturday. He still believed he was in the negotiation phase of his deception, unaware that the period for negotiation had closed the moment I heard his whisper in the dark. I stood by the window, watching the empty street, and felt the shift from prey to predator. My first move was logistical. I had spent the weekend researching firms that had no connection to my husband's professional network. I needed a shark, but a quiet one, someone who operated in the shadows of high-stakes matrimonial law and had no reason to golf with my husband or share scotch at the downtown club. I found her in a nondescript office building 3 districts away, a woman named Patricia who specialized in unconventional asset protection. I didn't call from the house. I drove to a quiet park, sat in my car with the engine off, and made the appointment from a burner phone I had purchased on Sunday. The drive to Patricia's office felt like a journey into a different version of my life. I watched the familiar city skyline pass by, realizing that I was looking at it through the eyes of someone who was already gone. I was still wearing my wedding ring, its diamond catching the sun and throwing mocking sparks across the steering wheel, but the woman who wore it was a ghost. The Susanna who trusted, who shared, and who dreamed was dead. The woman behind the wheel was a strategist, and she was currently calculating the distance between her current reality and her freedom. Patricia's office was a stark contrast to the dark wood and leather of my husband's world. It was all glass, steel, and white marble, smelling faintly of eucalyptus and expensive ink. She was a woman of few words and sharp eyes, looking at me not with pity, but with a clinical, focused intensity. I laid out the property transfer agreement on her desk, along with the bank statements I had printed in secret and the details of Ilya Morrow. I didn't cry. I didn't vent. I simply presented the evidence of the raid being conducted against my life. The legal reality was both terrifying and empowering. Because the condo had been purchased with my inheritance prior to the marriage, and because I had kept the accounts mostly separate, despite my husband's recent attempts to consolidate, there was still a window of opportunity. But it was a narrow one. If he filed for divorce before I moved, he could claim the commingling of assets based on our shared expenses and his purported management of the funds. He was setting the stage for a claim of marital property on things that were never his. He was trying to turn my premarital security into a shared pile that he could then split or, as the document suggested, seize entirely. Patricia's solution was the trust. It was a legal fortress, a way to move my assets into an irrevocable entity that would be managed by a third party, in this case, a private firm Patricia trusted. By placing the condo and my personal savings into this trust now, before any legal action was initiated by either party, I was effectively removing them from the board of the upcoming divorce. Legally, they would no longer belong to Susanna the wife, they would belong to the trust. When my husband eventually made his move, he would find the vault empty, the door locked, and the keys held by someone he couldn't bully or charm. The process of signing the papers felt like a baptism. Each stroke of the pen was a cord being cut. I signed the deed transfer for the condo, the authorization to move my savings, and the foundational documents of the trust. It was a silent, bloodless revolution. As I watched the notary stamp the pages, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. For years, I had allowed my husband to be the architect of our financial world, trusting his expertise and his intentions. In 1 hour, I had dismantled his structure and built my own. The most difficult part of the counterstrike wasn't the legalities, it was the digital migration. I spent the afternoon at a quiet library, using their secure Wi-Fi to log into my accounts. I watched the numbers disappear from one screen and reappear on another. It was a strange sensation, seeing the accumulation of a decade of work and inheritance turn into a series of flickering digits being rerouted through encrypted servers. Every click felt like a heartbeat. Every confirmation email felt like a victory. I moved the money with a precision that would have made my husband proud had he not been the target of it. I left the library as the sun began to set, the sky turning a bruised purple. I had to return to the house. I had to sit across from him at dinner. I had to sleep in the same bed. The silent part of the strike was the most crucial. If he suspected for a second that I had moved the pieces, he would accelerate his timeline and file for divorce before the transfers were fully settled. I needed 3 more days for the titles to clear and the trust to be finalized. 3 days of acting. 3 days of being the girl in the dark. Returning home was like stepping back into a haunted house. I walked through the door and found him in the kitchen, a bottle of wine already open. He looked relaxed, almost smug. He asked how my day was, his voice dripping with that manufactured concern that I now recognized as a probe. I told him I had spent the day at a museum and then lunching with a friend, crafting a narrative of mindless, domestic leisure. I kept my movements slow, my voice soft. I was the perfect image of a wife who was thinking it over, just as he wanted. Dinner was an exercise in extreme self-control. He spoke about a new project at the firm, his eyes gleaming with the excitement of a man who believed he was about to come into a great deal of money. He touched my arm as we cleared the plates, his fingers ghosting over the skin where the adrenaline was still humming. I felt a surge of revulsion so strong I thought I might be sick, but I suppressed it, forcing a small, weary smile. I told him I had a headache and wanted to go to bed early. He didn't follow me. He stayed downstairs, no doubt to call Ilya and tell her that I was coming around or that he had the situation under control. I lay in the darkness of our bedroom, listening to the muffled sound of his voice from the study below. He was so close to the finish line, he could taste it. He thought he had won because I was quiet. He thought silence was a sign of submission. He didn't know that silence was the sound of the locks clicking into place. He didn't know that the condo he was already planning to sell was no longer his to touch. He didn't know that the savings he had earmarked for his new life with Ilya were gone, tucked away in a fortress he didn't have the map to find. I stared at the ceiling, my eyes wide in the dark. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't a woman who would be blindsided by a server at the door or a frozen bank account. I was the one who had set the trap. The counterstrike was complete, and now, all that was left was the wait. In 72 hours, the trust would be irrevocable. In 72 hours, I would be untouchable. I closed my eyes and, for the first time since that midnight whisper, I slept. It was the deep, dreamless sleep of a soldier who had secured the perimeter. Let him whisper. Let him plot. The game was no longer his to play. The 72-hour window had closed. According to the encrypted confirmation email I had received earlier that afternoon, the trust was fully funded, the deeds were recorded, and the legal walls were officially impenetrable. I stood in the living room, watching the shadows of the oak trees outside stretch across the floor like skeletal fingers. The house felt different now, less like a home and more like a stage set whose lease was about to expire. I knew it was coming. The air had been brittle all day, charged with the static of a storm that had been brewing for months. When the front door opened, the sound didn't make me jump. I simply turned, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, watching as my husband walked in. He didn't drop his briefcase on the entry table with his usual weary sigh. He held onto it, his posture rigid, his face set in a mask of somber, rehearsed gravity. He didn't look at me with the fake warmth of the past few days. Instead, his gaze was detached, clinical, the look of a man about to deliver a verdict. He didn't offer a greeting. He walked to the center of the room and stood there, adjusting his cuffs. He looked around the space, his eyes lingering on the expensive furniture and the artwork as if he were already mentally tagging them for an estate sale. Then, finally, he turned his focus to me. He began to speak, and his voice was a masterpiece of manufactured regret. He told me that he had been doing a lot of soul-searching lately. He spoke about the distance between us, about how we had grown apart into two people who no longer shared the same values or the same path. He used phrases like irreconcilable differences and emotional stagnation, presenting the death of our marriage as a tragic, inevitable consequence of time rather than a calculated assassination he had been planning in the dark. I watched his mouth move, fascinated by the sheer audacity of the performance. He was playing the role of the reluctant truth-teller, the man brave enough to admit that the flame had gone out. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes without interruption, his tone even and controlled. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the tears, the pleas for a second chance, the hysterical demands for an explanation that he could then use to paint me as unstable. He wanted me to be the emotional wreck, so he could be the rational arbiter of our dissolution. When he finally finished, the silence that followed was deafening. He stood there, his chin slightly tilted up, radiating a smug, quiet power. He looked like a man who believed he had just delivered a checkmate before the opponent even knew the game had started. "I've already contacted a mediator," he added, his voice dropping to a softer, more compassionate register. "I think it's best if we handle this quietly. No need for messy lawyers or public drama. I've put together a preliminary settlement that I think is more than fair. It'll give you a clean break, Susanna. A chance to start over without the burden of managing all this complexity." The complexity he was referring to was my own life. The fair settlement was undoubtedly the same trap he had tried to spring on Saturday, the one that would leave me with a small lump sum while he walked away with the real wealth. He was so certain of his victory that he didn't even notice I wasn't crying. He didn't notice that my hands weren't shaking. "Grown apart," I repeated, the words sounding hollow in the vast room. I tilted my head, looking at him as if he were a curious specimen under a microscope. "Is that the narrative we're going with, then? A simple case of drifting away?" His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. I wasn't following the script. "It's the truth, Susanna. We haven't been happy for a long time. You have to see that." "I see a lot of things," I said softly. I began to walk toward him, my footsteps silent on the rug. I saw him stiffen, his confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. "I see the late-night phone calls. I see the business investments to shell companies. I see the name Ilya Morrow." The effect was instantaneous. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. His jaw went slack, and for the first time in 10 years, I saw him speechless. The silence stretched between us, no longer heavy, but sharp and dangerous. I know about the hotel, the wire transfers, and the plan to strip me of my assets before the ink on the petition was even dry. I continued, my voice gaining strength with every word. I stood directly in front of him now, close enough to see the beads of sweat forming on his brow. You didn't want a separation because we grew apart. You wanted a heist. He tried to recover, his mind clearly racing to find a new lie, a way to spin this back into his favor. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to gaslight, to deflect, but I didn't give him the chance. Don't, I said, the word cutting through the air like a blade. Don't bother with another lie. It's beneath both of us at this point. You thought you were the only one playing a game, but you forgot that I'm the one who taught you how to read the board. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh, his eyes hardening into something ugly and predatory. The loving husband was gone, replaced by the man who had whispered in the hallway. So you found out. So what? You think knowing changes anything? I'm the one with the firm, Susanna. I'm the one with the connections. I've spent months making sure that when this day came, you'd be exactly where I wanted you, with nothing. You can scream about Ilya all you want, but on paper I've already won. He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. By the time a judge looks at our accounts, you'll be lucky if you walk away with the clothes on your back. I've moved the money. I've restructured the holdings. You're holding an empty bag and there isn't a damn thing you can do about it. He looked at me with a triumphant, cruel smile, waiting for the realization of my penniless future to crush me. He was so proud of his cleverness, so convinced that his months of plotting had been successful. I let the silence hang for a moment, savoring the peak of his arrogance. Then I leaned in, my voice a mere whisper that carried more weight than any scream. Check the accounts again, I said. He frowned, his confusion momentarily overriding his anger. What? The condo, the savings, the investment portfolio I inherited, I said, my smile slow and cold. Check them. Because while you were busy siphoning off a few $1,000s here and there for your little investments, I was busy building a fortress. Legally, I don't own those assets anymore. The trust does. And you, my dear, are not a beneficiary. The shift in the room was palpable. The air seemed to leave his lungs in a ragged gasp. He stumbled back a step, his eyes wide with a sudden, dawning horror. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The way his hands began to tremble as he reached for his phone told me everything I needed to know. He had walked into the room expecting to deliver a finishing blow to a defenseless victim. Instead, he had found himself staring down the barrel of his own greed. The mask was off, the game was out in the open, and for the first time in our marriage, I was the one holding all the cards. You're going to regret this, he muttered, though the threat lacked its usual bite. It sounded like the desperate plea of a man who realized the ground had just disappeared beneath his feet. I didn't answer. I simply turned and walked toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. The war was no longer silent, but the first battle had been won. The air in the living room felt like a compressed spring, vibrating with a tension that was almost audible. My husband stood frozen, his phone gripped in his hand like a weapon that had suddenly jammed. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was filled with the wreckage of 10 years of shared history and the sharp, jagged edges of his failed ambition. I watched him, my heart steady and my breathing rhythmic, as the reality of my words began to penetrate his calculated confidence. He was no longer the architect. He was the man standing in the ruins of a building he thought he owned. He finally moved, his thumbs flying across the screen of his phone with a desperate, frantic energy. I waited. I didn't need to see his screen to know what he was looking at. He was logging into the accounts he had spent months trying to manipulate, the ones he had earmarked for his new life. I could see the moment the data loaded. His face, already pale, turned a sickly, translucent white. His jaw tightened so hard I could see the pulse thumping in his temple. He looked at me, and for the first time, the mask of the sophisticated professional vanished completely, replaced by a raw, naked fury. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a rage he could no longer contain. He stepped toward me, the phone still clutched in his fist. "Where is the money, Susanna? The transfer for the condo. It's gone. Everything is gone." "It's not gone," I replied, my voice cool and level, a stark contrast to his rising heat. "It's protected. It belongs to a trust now, an entity you have no legal standing to access. I simply did what you suggested on Saturday. I consolidated my assets for liability protection. I just didn't include you in the liability." He let out a guttural sound, a half-laugh, half-growl of pure frustration. He began to pace the room, his movements jerky and agitated. "You think you're so clever. You think you can just move marital assets in the middle of a separation? Any judge will see right through this. It's fraud. It's a transparent attempt to hide property. I'll have that trust dismantled in a week." I watched him spiral, his threats becoming more grandiose the more he realized he had lost his grip. "It's not a marital asset," I reminded him gently. "The condo was bought before we met. The savings were inherited. And as for the timing, you haven't filed for separation yet, remember? You are the one who just walked in here 5 minutes ago and told me we'd grown apart. Legally, until those papers are served, I have every right to manage my personal property as I see fit. And I saw fit to move it away from you." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes dark with a venomous light. "You've been spying on me. You've been digging through my things. You had no right, Susanna."
"None."
"I had every right to protect myself from a man who whispers in the dark," I said, my voice finally losing its clinical edge and sharpening into a blade. "I heard you on the phone. I saw the messages from Ilya Morrow. I saw the transfers to Tech Holdings. You didn't just want a divorce, you wanted to erase me. You wanted to leave me with nothing while you and your asset specialist built a life on my inheritance." The mention of Ilya's name was the final blow to his composure. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain it away. The time for lies had passed, and in its place was a brutal, honest hatred. He looked at me not as his wife, but as a hurdle he had failed to jump. His true intentions were now laid bare, stripped of the flowery language about growing apart. He wanted the money, he wanted the power, and he wanted me broken. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating threat. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning. I will take you to court. I will drag your name through the mud. I will make sure everyone knows what kind of calculating, paranoid woman you really are. I'm going to take half of everything you think you've hidden, and then I'm going to take the rest for spousal support. You won't have enough left to buy a cup of coffee when I'm done with you." He turned and stormed out of the room, the front door slamming with a force that rattled the windows. The house was silent again, but the silence was different now. It was the silence of a battlefield after the first major engagement. I sat down on the sofa, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, leaving me cold and hollow. I had won the reveal, but I knew his threats weren't empty. He was a man with resources, a man with a vengeful streak, and most importantly, a man who felt humiliated. The next few days were a blur of defensive preparations. I stayed in constant contact with Patricia, whose calm, tactical mind was the only thing keeping me grounded. We documented everything, the original bank statements, the evidence of a siphoning, the property transfer agreement he had tried to force me to sign. We were building our own fortress of paper. The blow came on Thursday. I was in the kitchen, making tea, when there was a sharp, rhythmic knocking at the door. It wasn't my husband. He had been staying at a hotel, or perhaps with Ilya, since the confrontation. I opened the door to find a man in a nondescript suit holding a thick envelope. He asked for my name, and when I confirmed it, he handed me the package with a practiced, indifferent expression. "You've been served," he said, before turning and walking back to his car. I stood on the porch, the envelope feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. I walked back inside and sat at the table, my hands trembling as I tore it open. The words at the top of the first page were bold and clinical. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." I skimmed through the legal jargon, my eyes hunting for the demands. He wasn't just asking for a divorce. He was asking for the world. He demanded 50% of all assets, including the condo, and the trust one had just formed. He claimed the trust was a fraudulent conveyance designed to deprive him of his marital rights. But it was the final page that made me gasp. He was requesting permanent spousal support, claiming that his standard of living was dependent on our joint income and that my deceptive financial maneuvers had caused him significant professional and emotional distress. He was suing me for the right to live off my money for the rest of his life. The audacity was breathtaking. He had spent months trying to steal from me, and now that he had been caught, he was attempting to use the court system to finish the job legally. He was trying to turn his betrayal into a paycheck. I picked up the phone and called Patricia. My voice was steady, but there was a new, hard edge to it. I didn't tell her I was scared. I didn't tell her I was overwhelmed. I told her the papers had arrived and that he was going for the throat. Good, Patricia said, her voice sounding almost cheerful through the line. Let him go for the throat. It makes it easier for us to see where he's vulnerable. He's overreaching, Susanna. He's acting out of ego and desperation. Men like that always make mistakes. He wants half of the trust, I said. He wants spousal support. He can want the moon, she replied. But we have the paper trail. We have the proof of his intent. We're going to file our response tomorrow, and we're going to include a request for a full audit of his business accounts. If he wants to play in the mud, we'll make sure he's the one who gets dirty. I hung up the phone and looked out at the garden. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. The checkmate had been revealed, the pieces were in motion, and the lines were drawn. He thought the divorce papers were his winning move, a way to reclaim the control he had lost. But he still didn't understand. I wasn't the woman he had married anymore. I was the woman who had survived him. The war was no longer silent. It was loud, it was public, and it was going to be brutal. But as I watched the last of the light fade, I felt a strange sense of peace. The worst had happened. The mask was off. The papers were served. Now all that was left was to fight. And I had never been better prepared for a fight in my life. The silence of the house was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a vacuum, waiting to be filled by the noise of the outside world. I had expected the legal battle to be cold and clinical, a war of signatures and bank statements. What I didn't expect was the scorched earth policy my husband adopted the moment he realized his financial grip had slipped. He wasn't content with just trying to take my money. He wanted to dismantle the very foundation of who I was. He wanted to destroy my name. The first hint of the campaign came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I had been served. I walked into the office of the marketing firm where I had worked for the last 8 years, a place where I felt respected and secure. Usually, the lobby was a buzz of good mornings and hurried conversations about campaign deadlines. But as I stepped through the glass doors, the atmosphere curdled. My assistant, a bright woman who usually greeted me with a rundown of my schedule and a hot latte, didn't look up from her monitor. When she finally did, her eyes were wide, darting away from mine as if she were looking at someone with a contagious disease. I felt a cold prickle of unease. As I walked toward my corner office, the hushed whispers followed me like a wake. Conversations died abruptly as I passed, only to start up again with renewed intensity the moment I was out of earshot. I closed my office door and leaned against it, my heart hammering. I hadn't even set my bag down before my desk phone rang. It was the managing director, a man I had considered a mentor. His voice, usually booming and jovial, was tight and formal. He asked me to come to his office immediately. The walk down the hall felt like a mile. When I entered his office, he wasn't alone. The head of human resources was there, sitting with a folder open on her lap.
They didn't ask me to sit.
Susanna, the director began, clearing his throat. We've received some disturbing information. Anonymously, at first, but then confirmed by several concerned parties close to your family. There are allegations regarding your personal financial conduct. I felt the blood drain from my face. Allegations?
What are you talking about?
He sighed, looking pained. The claim is that you've been using your position here to facilitate the movement of large sums of money, laundering, to be blunt, from your joint marital accounts into private offshore trusts. There's mention of tech holdings and falsified consulting fees. Because you handle some of our largest accounts, the board is terrified of a secondary investigation into the firm's books. I felt like I had been slapped. The sheer brilliance of his lie was terrifying. He was taking the very entities he had created, the shell companies and the siphon funds, and pinning them on me. He was twisting my defensive move of creating a trust into a criminal act of money laundering. That's a lie, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. My husband is the one who created those companies. I moved my personal inheritance into a legal trust to protect it from his theft. I have the papers. I have the proof. That may be true, Susanna. The HR had intervened, her voice cold and professional. But until this is cleared up, your presence here is a liability. The rumor is already all over the industry. We've had 2 clients call this morning asking why one of our senior partners is being accused of financial fraud. We're placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately. I left the building in a daze, the mid-morning sun feeling too bright and too hot. My husband had struck me where it hurt most. He knew that my career was my pride, my independence, and my social circle. By poisoning the well at work, he was isolating me, making me look like a criminal before I even had a chance to speak to a judge. But it didn't stop at the office. By evening, my phone was a graveyard of ignored messages and missed calls. The concerned parties he had spoken to were our mutual friends. He was playing the part of the heartbroken, betrayed husband to perfection. He was telling anyone who would listen that I had been unstable for months, that I had been hiding money in preparation for a calculated betrayal, and that he was just a victim trying to understand how the woman he loved could become so cold and deceptive. I sat in my dark living room, the screen of my phone illuminating the tears I could no longer hold back. A message from our oldest friends, a couple we had traveled with for years, popped up. Susanna, we're so disappointed. We thought we knew you. Please don't contact us until this is settled. He was erasing me from my own life. He was taking my reputation and feeding it to a fire he had lit himself. The gaslighting had moved from the private confines of our marriage to the public stage. I felt a crushing sense of loneliness, a weight that threatened to pull me under. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to call him, sobbing, and beg for mercy. Mercy that would surely come with a price, the return of the assets and my total submission. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over his contact name. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him I knew what he was doing. I wanted to beg him to stop. But then, I remembered Patricia's voice. He's acting out of ego and desperation. Men like that always make mistakes. I pull my hand back. If I reacted now, I was giving him exactly what he wanted, proof of my instability. If I fought him in the court of public opinion, I would be rolling in the mud with a man who had nothing left to lose. I had to be the one who stayed silent. I had to let the storm howl around me while I remained the eye of it. I stood up and walked to my bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and my skin was pale, but the woman looking back at me wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a liar. She was a survivor who was being tested. He thought he could win by ruining my name. He thought that by taking away my job and my friends, he would take away my will to fight. He was wrong. Every rumor he spread, every lie he told, was just more evidence of his malice. I picked up my laptop and began a new document. I didn't write a rebuttal for Facebook or an email to my boss. I wrote a list of every person he had contacted, every lie he had told, and every professional contact he had sabotaged. I would not defend myself to people who were so quick to believe a lie. I would defend myself in a courtroom where the truth was a matter of record, not a matter of gossip. The smear campaign was his most desperate move yet. It was the act of a man who knew he couldn't win on the merits of the law, so he was trying to win on the wreckage of my life. But a reputation can be rebuilt. A career can be recovered. A soul, however, once sold for greed and vengeance, is much harder to reclaim. As the night deepened, I felt the cold, hard resolve returning. He had taken my peace, my job, and my friends. But he hadn't taken the trust. He hadn't taken the evidence. And he hadn't taken my dignity. I would walk into that courtroom not as the woman the rumors described, but as the woman who had documented every single one of them. I would let him talk. I would let him lie. And then I would let the truth bury him. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and old paper, a dry, sterile scent that did nothing to mask the underlying odor of anxiety. I sat at the mahogany table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had turned the color of bone. Beside me, Patricia was a statue of calm, her attention focused on organizing a stack of files with methodical precision. Across the aisle, my husband sat with his legal team. He looked impeccable in a navy suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, projecting the image of a successful man who had been wronged by a vindictive, unstable wife.
He wouldn't look at me.
He stared straight ahead at the judge's empty bench, his jaw set in a line of righteous determination. This was the day he had been building toward since the moment he first whispered into his phone in the dark. This was the crescendo of his campaign to destroy me. He wasn't just here to fight for assets. He was here to criminalize my defense. When the judge entered, a stern woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, the air in the room shifted. The shuffling of papers stopped. The murmurs died. The bailiff called the court to order, and the proceedings began with a terrifying efficiency. My husband's lawyer, a man with a booming voice and a theatrical style, wasted no time in painting the picture they had constructed. He described me not just as a spouse hiding assets, but as a sophisticated fraudster. He used words like embezzlement, falsification, and malicious intent. He claimed that the trust one had created was funded not by my inheritance, but by systematic siphoning of joint marital funds that I had then covered up with doctored bank statements. Your Honor, he announced, holding up a thick binder. We have evidence that Mrs. Keller did not merely move assets. She fabricated financial records to conceal the true origin of the funds. These documents, retrieved and analyzed by our financial expert, Ms. Iliamaro, show a clear pattern of deceit. He approached the bench and submitted the binder. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Iliamaro. She wasn't just his shadow anymore. She was his weapon, brought into the light of the court. They were submitting forged documents to prove I was the forger. The audacity of it was suffocating. I looked at Patricia, panic rising in my throat, but she didn't flinch. She simply watched the exchange with a hawk-like intensity, her pen hovering over her legal pad. The judge accepted the binder and began to flip through the pages. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the weight of the lie being told. My husband finally turned to look at me. A small, cruel smile played on his lips, a look of absolute triumph. He thought this was the end. He thought he had outsmarted me one last time. Then, Patricia stood up. Your Honor, she said, her voice cool and cutting through the theatrical atmosphere like a scalpel. Before you rule on the admissibility of these documents, the defense requests permission to present the findings of our own forensic audit regarding the provenance of this so-called evidence. The judge looked over her glasses. Proceed. Patricia signaled to the back of the room, and our forensic accountant, a quiet man named Mr. Henderson, stepped forward. He carried a laptop and a single, thin folder. He took the stand and was sworn in. The shift in the room was subtle at first. My husband's lawyer looked annoyed, dismissive. My husband looked bored. But as Mr. Henderson began to speak, the boredom evaporated. I have reviewed the digital copies of the bank statements submitted by the plaintiff, Mr. Henderson stated, his voice dry and factual. Specifically, the transaction logs dated from January to March of this year, which purportedly show Mrs. Keller transferring joint funds into her private trust. And what did you find? Patricia asked. I found metadata anomalies, Mr. Henderson replied. He opened his folder. The documents submitted by Mr. Keller and Ms. Morrow appear to be authentic bank records. However, a deeper analysis of the file creation dates reveals that they were modified 3 days ago, long after the supposed transactions took place. But the most damning evidence, Your Honor, is in the timestamps of the transactions themselves. He paused, adjusting his glasses. I held my breath. The plaintiff's evidence shows a transfer of $50,000 from the joint savings account to Mrs. Keller's trust on February 14th at 2:30 p.m., Mr. Henderson continued. However, the bank's own server logs, which we subpoenaed directly from the institution, show that the joint savings account was frozen for maintenance that entire day due to a system-wide upgrade. No transactions could have been processed. Furthermore, the routing number listed on the receiving end of the transfer, the trust account, did not exist on February 14th. The trust was not legally incorporated, nor was the bank account opened, until February 20th. A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. The judge stopped flipping through the binder and looked up, her expression hardening. Are you saying, the judge asked slowly, that these documents show money moving into an account that did not yet exist? That is correct, Your Honor, Mr. Henderson said. It is physically and digitally impossible for these transactions to have occurred as depicted. The timestamps were manually inserted. Whoever forged these documents made a chronological error. They tried to backdate the fraud to justify the plaintiff's filing, but they failed to check the incorporation date of the trust or the bank's maintenance schedule. I looked at my husband. The color had drained from his face so completely that he looked like a wax figure. The smug smile was gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He turned to his lawyer, whispering frantically, but the lawyer was staring at the binder in his hands as if it were a live grenade. Patricia wasn't finished. Your Honor, this is not merely a clerical error. This is a deliberate submission of falsified evidence to the court. It is perjury. It is fraud. And it was orchestrated by the plaintiff and his associate, Ms. Morrow, in an attempt to frame my client for a crime she did not commit. The judge closed the binder with a sharp thud that echoed like a gunshot. She looked at my husband's lawyer, her eyes cold. Counselor, do you have an explanation for why your client has submitted forged bank records to this court? The lawyer stood up, stammering, his booming voice reduced to a squeak. Your Honor, I was not aware. These documents were provided to me by the client and his financial advisor. I assumed. You assumed wrong, the judge snapped. This court does not look kindly on being used as a tool for extortion. The evidence submitted by the plaintiff is hereby stricken from the record. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the origin of these documents.